"Ma'am, I can't let you in the cockpit. Security rules." Those words seemed so right at the time. But when the pilot suddenly collapsed at 160 miles per hour during takeoff, with 143 people screaming toward disaster, the flight attendant remembered something terrifying. The woman she had just refused entry was a master pilot with thousands of hours of experience, sitting helplessly in the passenger cabin. The morning sun cast long shadows across Terminal C at Denver International Airport as passengers shuffled through the gate area for Flight 247 to San Francisco, a routine Monday morning departure that would become anything but ordinary. Among the crowd of business travelers and tourists stood Rebecca Chen, a woman in her early 40s whose casual jeans and navy blazer suggested nothing remarkable about her presence. She carried a worn leather messenger bag and moved with a quiet confidence that most passengers failed to notice, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail as she checked her boarding pass one final time. The gate agent's voice crackled through the speaker system, announcing pre-boarding for families and passengers requiring assistance, followed by the general boarding call that sent a wave of passengers surging toward the jetway entrance. Rebecca waited patiently as the crowd thinned, watching the organized chaos with eyes that had witnessed thousands of such boarding processes from a very different perspective. She had flown this route countless times before, though never quite like this, never as just another passenger in seat 12A with nothing to distinguish her from the dozens of other travelers making their way onto the Boeing 737-800. As she approached the aircraft door, she paused to glance toward the cockpit, visible through the open door where two pilots were running through their pre-flight checks, their movements practiced and methodical as they prepared for departure. For a moment, she considered introducing herself, perhaps mentioning the weather reports she had reviewed that morning showing moderate turbulence over the Rockies, but she dismissed the thought almost immediately, reminding herself that she was traveling as a civilian today, not as a colleague or professional advisor. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Jennifer, whose bright smile and crisp uniform suggested years of experience, greeted passengers at the door with practiced warmth. Rebecca returned the smile and started to move past, then hesitated, turning back with a casual expression that masked her internal debate about whether to identify herself. "Excuse me," Rebecca said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that other boarding passengers wouldn't overhear. "I noticed the pilots are still in their pre-flight sequence. I was wondering if I might have a quick word with them about the flight conditions today. Just a brief conversation before we push back." Jennifer's smile remained fixed, but her eyes immediately took on a more guarded quality, the subtle shift that every flight attendant learned during post-9/11 security training when evaluating unusual passenger requests. "I appreciate your interest in aviation," Jennifer replied with professional courtesy, her tone friendly but firm, "but I'm afraid cockpit access is strictly prohibited for passengers under federal security regulations. The flight deck remains secured and locked throughout the entire flight, with absolutely no exceptions, regardless of the reason for the request." She gestured toward the cabin with an apologetic but inflexible expression. "If you have concerns about weather or flight conditions, I'd be happy to pass along a message to the captain, but direct cockpit access simply isn't possible under any circumstances." Rebecca nodded with understanding, offering no argument or explanation that might complicate the situation, fully aware of the ironclad security protocols that had transformed commercial aviation over the past 2 decades. "Of course, I completely understand," Rebecca said graciously, recognizing that Jennifer was simply following the mandatory procedures that protected every flight. "I wasn't thinking about the security restrictions. No message necessary, thank you." She moved down the aisle toward her seat, aware that several passengers nearby had overheard the brief exchange, their curious glances suggesting they had categorized her as just another aviation enthusiast who didn't comprehend modern security requirements. A man in a business suit 2 rows ahead muttered something to his seatmate about people who watched too many pre-9/11 movies where passengers could wander into cockpits, and Rebecca suppressed a wry smile at the assumption, knowing that her request had indeed been naive given current protocols, regardless of her actual qualifications. As she settled into seat 12A, stowing her bag under the seat in front of her, Rebecca reminded herself why she had chosen anonymity for this trip. She was traveling to San Francisco for her daughter's college graduation, a purely personal journey where she wanted to be just another proud mother in the audience, not Captain Rebecca Chen, the woman whose career had taken her from Air Force test pilot programs to commercial aviation's most demanding routes, who had logged over 15,000 flight hours across every aircraft type, from fighter jets to wide-body transports, who had trained pilots on emergency procedures and served as a check airman evaluating other captains' proficiency. She had deliberately booked this flight under her maiden name and dressed casually to avoid the recognition that often came when airline personnel discovered a fellow pilot traveling in the cabin, the professional courtesy that sometimes resulted in cockpit visits or upgrades she simply didn't want today. The cabin filled steadily as passengers located their seats, stuffed oversized carry-ons into overhead bins, and settled in for the 2-hour flight. Rebecca watched the familiar pre-departure routine with the trained eye of someone who had orchestrated this dance thousands of times, noting the flight attendants' efficiency as they checked seatbelts and secured the cabin, the way Jennifer moved through the aisle with practiced grace while making final checks before door closure. Through the window, Rebecca could see ground crew members removing chocks from the wheels and disconnecting the jet bridge, the synchronized choreography of departure preparation that happened hundreds of times daily at every major airport. The captain's voice came through the speaker system with the standard welcome announcement, introducing himself as Captain David Morrison with First Officer Sarah Park, noting their flight time of 1 hour and 53 minutes with an on-time arrival expected in San Francisco despite forecasted headwinds over the Rockies. Rebecca listened to the announcement with professional interest, noting the captain's calm, experienced voice that suggested thousands of hours in command, the kind of voice that reassured nervous passengers and indicated competent leadership. She had no reason to question the crew's qualifications or readiness, no indication that anything about this flight would be anything other than routine. As the engine spooled up and the aircraft pushed back from the gate, she pulled out a book from her bag, determined to disconnect from her professional identity and simply enjoy the flight as a passenger for once, letting someone else handle the responsibilities of command while she relaxed and thought about the upcoming graduation ceremony. The pushback completed smoothly, and the aircraft began its taxi toward runway 34L, joining the queue of departing flights in the steady stream of morning traffic. The taxi seemed longer than usual, giving Rebecca time to notice details she rarely paid attention to as a passenger. The slight bounce of the nose gear over uneven pavement, the asymmetric thrust as the pilots used differential power to make turns, the gentle sway of the wings as they rolled past other aircraft waiting for departure clearance. She found herself unconsciously monitoring the sounds and sensations of the aircraft, her trained senses automatically processing information even as she tried to ignore them, years of experience making it impossible to completely disconnect from the environment. Other passengers chatted casually, pulled out laptops and tablets, or dozed off already, completely unaware of the complex coordination happening between pilots, controllers, and ground crew that made their journey possible. A young woman across the aisle asked her companion nervously if takeoff was the most dangerous part of flying, and Rebecca resisted the urge to explain that statistically, the takeoff and landing phases accounted for the majority of incidents despite representing only a tiny fraction of total flight time. The aircraft reached the runway hold short line and paused as the pilots completed their final checks, running through the takeoff briefing and confirming configurations one last time before accepting their departure clearance. Rebecca felt the familiar anticipation that always preceded takeoff, the moment when tons of aluminum and fuel would defy gravity through the miracle of aerodynamics and engineering, when split-second timing and precise control inputs would transition the aircraft from ground vehicle to flying machine. The tower cleared Flight 247 for takeoff, and the aircraft rolled onto the runway centerline, the pilots aligning carefully with the white stripes that stretched nearly 2 miles ahead toward the far end, where the runway disappeared into the morning haze. The engines remained at idle for a moment, that pregnant pause before power application that every pilot knew well, the final second to abort if anything seemed wrong before committing to the takeoff roll. Then the engines roared to full power. The sudden acceleration pressed Rebecca back into her seat as the aircraft began its takeoff roll down runway 34L. The familiar vibration of the nose gear rumbling over runway lights created a rhythmic sensation as speed built rapidly, 40 knots, 60 knots, 80 knots, the airplane accelerating with the purposeful urgency of over 30 tons being hurled down the runway by twin turbofan engines generating 48,000 pounds of thrust. Rebecca's trained mind automatically tracked the progression. V1 would be approaching around 140 knots, the critical decision speed beyond which the takeoff must continue even if an engine failed, followed seconds later by VR, rotation speed, when the pilots would smoothly pull back on the yoke to lift the nose wheel off the runway and transition to flight. She felt herself relax slightly as the takeoff progressed normally, the comforting routine of a well-executed departure unfolding exactly as it should. But then something changed. Rebecca sensed it before she understood it, a subtle deviation in the aircraft's behavior that triggered alarm bells in her subconscious. The acceleration continued past where rotation should have occurred, the nose still firmly planted on the runway as airspeed built beyond VR. Now approaching VR plus 10 knots with the nose still down, the runway rapidly disappeared beneath them as precious distance evaporated. Her body tensed as professional instincts overrode her passenger mindset, recognizing instantly that something was terribly wrong in the cockpit, that the pilots had missed their rotation cue by several critical seconds. Through the window, she could see runway markers flashing past with alarming speed, each white stripe representing another 1,000 feet of runway consumed, the far end approaching where the smooth concrete gave way to rough terrain and approach lights. In the cockpit, First Officer Sarah Park was experiencing a nightmare scenario that no amount of training could fully prepare anyone to handle. Captain Morrison had been reaching for the yoke to initiate rotation when he suddenly gasped, his hand falling away from the controls as his entire body went rigid for a moment before slumping forward against his harness, completely unresponsive. Sarah's mind struggled to process what was happening even as her hands flew to the controls, taking over manually while simultaneously trying to understand why her captain had just collapsed during the most critical phase of flight. They were already 5 knots past rotation speed and still accelerating, committed to the takeoff with insufficient runway remaining to abort, the decision made not by choice but by physics and the impossibility of stopping a fully loaded 737 from this speed. "Captain Morrison," Sarah shouted, her voice cracking with panic as she pulled back on the yoke to initiate rotation, later than optimal but still within acceptable parameters if she executed perfectly. The nose lifted off the runway as she brought the aircraft to the proper pitch angle, 10 degrees nose up, the main gear still rolling along the centerline as the wings generated lift. But her mind was fragmenting between multiple simultaneous emergencies: flying the aircraft through a critical takeoff, dealing with an incapacitated captain who might be having a heart attack, communicating the emergency to air traffic control, and managing the overwhelming psychological shock of suddenly being alone in command during the most dangerous phase of flight. Her training screamed at her to fly the aircraft first, to maintain precise control through the takeoff and initial climb, but the sight of Captain Morrison slumped unconscious in the left seat kept drawing her attention away from the instruments. The main gear lifted off the runway with less than 2,000 feet remaining, the aircraft transitioning to flight with minimal margin for error as Sarah fought to maintain the correct pitch, attitude, and airspeed. Her hands trembled on the controls as she raised the landing gear, the hydraulic whine barely audible over the roar of the engines and the hammering of her heart. "Denver Tower, Flight 247 Heavy, declaring an emergency," she transmitted, her voice shaking despite her efforts to sound professional. "Captain is incapacitated, requesting immediate assistance and priority handling." The tower controller's response came back instantly, offering any assistance needed and clearing the flight to climb to 10,000 feet. But Sarah barely processed the words, overwhelmed by the cascade of tasks demanding her attention simultaneously. In the cabin, passengers remained mostly unaware of the crisis unfolding in the cockpit, interpreting the later than normal rotation as nothing more than a slightly rough takeoff, perhaps due to the wind conditions or the pilots being cautious with the heavy aircraft. But Rebecca knew better. She had felt the hesitation, recognized the extended ground roll that exceeded normal parameters, understood that something significant had gone wrong during those critical seconds when the pilots should have rotated smoothly at VR but instead had continued down the runway with the nose still planted. Her hands gripped the armrests as she stared forward toward the cockpit door, her professional mind racing through possibilities: control malfunction, pilot incapacitation, distraction by an instrument failure, asymmetric thrust from an engine problem. None of the explanations were good, and all of them suggested that the crew was dealing with a serious emergency that had manifested at the worst possible moment. Jennifer, the lead flight attendant, appeared in the aisle, moving rapidly toward the front of the cabin, her professional smile replaced by a tense expression that suggested something was wrong. She pressed the interphone handset to her ear, listening intently to a message from the cockpit, and Rebecca watched her face pale as she absorbed whatever information was being conveyed. Jennifer's eyes darted across the cabin as if searching for something, Then she spoke urgently into the handset before hanging up and rushing forward toward the cockpit, her usual grace abandoned in favor of speed. Other passengers began noticing her urgency, exchanging worried glances and murmuring questions about whether something was wrong, their casual conversations dying away as anxiety rippled through the cabin. Rebecca unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, ignoring the illuminated "Fasten Seatbelt" sign, her instincts telling her that whatever was happening required immediate attention and that standard passenger protocols had just become irrelevant. She moved into the aisle and followed Jennifer toward the front of the cabin, drawing startled looks from nearby passengers who wondered what gave her the authority to violate the seatbelt sign during takeoff. At the forward galley, Jennifer was standing by the cockpit door using the interphone to communicate with the first officer inside, her face a mask of controlled panic as she absorbed information about the captain's condition and the desperate situation in the cockpit. "I need to get in there," Rebecca said firmly, her voice cutting through Jennifer's concentration with an authority that made the flight attendant turn sharply. "I'm a captain with over 15,000 hours, including 12 years flying 737s. Whatever is happening in that cockpit, I can help." Jennifer's eyes widened with shock and confusion, her mind struggling to reconcile this passenger who had been denied cockpit access 30 minutes earlier with the confident professional now standing before her claiming elite pilot credentials. "The captain collapsed during takeoff," Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper, her professional composure cracking under the stress. "He's unconscious, and the first officer is alone trying to fly and handle the emergency. She's asking if anyone on board has aviation experience." Rebecca's expression hardened with determination, her casual passenger demeanor evaporating as decades of training and experience took over. "Open that door now," she commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "Every second counts." Jennifer fumbled with the cockpit door access code, her hands shaking as she punched in the emergency entry sequence, the security system that had seemed so essential an hour earlier now an obstacle between the crisis and its solution. The door lock clicked open, and Rebecca pushed through into the cockpit without hesitation, her eyes immediately scanning the scene and cataloging information with the trained efficiency of an emergency responder. Captain Morrison was slumped forward in the left seat, held in place only by his 4-point harness, his face ashen, his breathing shallow and labored. First Officer Park sat rigid in the right seat, both hands gripping the yoke with white-knuckled intensity as she fought to maintain control of the aircraft while simultaneously processing the trauma of having her captain collapse beside her during the most demanding phase of flight. The aircraft was climbing through 4,000 feet, the engines at takeoff thrust, the flight director commanding a specific pitch and bank angle that Sarah was struggling to follow precisely while her mind fragmented under stress. Rebecca took in the complete picture in less than 2 seconds, the altitude, airspeed, vertical speed, engine parameters, navigation displays, the disabled autopilot Sarah hadn't dared engage yet, the transponder squawking 7,700 to indicate an emergency, the radio frequency already set to departure control. "First Officer Park, I'm Captain Rebecca Chen," Rebecca announced clearly, moving to the left seat where Morrison remained unconscious. "I have 15,000 hours, including 12 years as a 737 captain and check airman. I'm taking the left seat to assist. Continue flying the aircraft." Sarah's head snapped toward Rebecca, her eyes showing a mixture of desperate relief and residual shock, her hands still frozen on the controls as if releasing them would cause the aircraft to plummet from the sky. "Help me get him out," Rebecca said, already unbuckling Morrison's harness with practiced efficiency. "We need him in the cabin where the flight attendants can provide medical care, and I need to get into that seat." Together, they maneuvered the unconscious captain out of the left seat, Jennifer and another flight attendant helping to support his weight as they carefully extracted him from the cramped cockpit and laid him in the forward galley, where they could begin emergency medical treatment. Rebecca slid into the still warm left seat, immediately adjusting it forward to reach the pedals properly, her hands finding the yoke and throttles with the unconscious familiarity of someone who had occupied this exact position thousands of times. She scanned the instruments with trained efficiency, processing altitude, airspeed, vertical speed, heading, engine parameters, and navigation status in a single sweeping glance that told her everything about the aircraft's current state. They were climbing through 6,000 feet at 240 knots, the engine still at takeoff thrust, which needed to be reduced to climb thrust, the aircraft properly configured with gear up and flaps retracting to the clean configuration. "Sarah, talk to me," Rebecca said calmly, her voice carrying the steady authority that immediately began to reduce the first officer's panic. "What's your status? Are you able to continue as pilot monitoring, or do you need a moment?" Sarah took a shaky breath, her professional training beginning to reassert itself now that she was no longer alone with the overwhelming responsibility of command. "I can continue," she said, her voice strengthening. "The captain just collapsed at rotation. I rotated late and we barely got off the ground. Everything else has been normal since liftoff. Tower knows we have an emergency and we're cleared to 10,000. Outstanding job getting us airborne," Rebecca said with genuine appreciation, recognizing that Sarah had executed the most critical flying under impossibly difficult circumstances. "That was the hardest part. Now we're going to work together to stabilize this situation and get everyone safely on the ground. I'm taking control as pilot flying, you're pilot monitoring. Let's reduce to climb thrust and verify our configuration." Rebecca's hands moved with practiced precision, pulling the throttles back from takeoff to climb detent, the engine roar diminishing slightly as thrust reduced to a more sustainable level. Sarah worked through the after-takeoff checklist with growing confidence, her training taking over as the presence of an experienced captain in the left seat allowed her to focus on procedures rather than panic. "Flight 247, Denver departure, climb and maintain 15,000, the controller's voice came through the speakers, offering them more altitude and time to assess their situation. "We have emergency equipment standing by and we're clearing traffic from your area. What are your intentions?" Rebecca keyed the radio transmit button on the yoke. "Denver departure, Flight 247. We'd like to level at 10,000 while we assess our situation and determine if we're returning to Denver or continuing to San Francisco. Captain is unconscious and receiving medical attention in the cabin. First officer and relief captain are managing the aircraft. We'll advise intentions in 5 minutes." The use of relief captain was deliberate, forestalling any questions about Rebecca's authority to be in the cockpit, presenting the controller with the simplest explanation that would avoid complications and allow them to focus on flying. Sarah glanced at her with gratitude, recognizing the professional courtesy that had just legitimized Rebecca's presence without lengthy explanations. Together, they leveled the aircraft at 10,000 feet, reducing speed to a comfortable cruise configuration while they assessed their options. Through the cockpit windows, the Rocky Mountains spread below them in the morning sun, the terrain they would need to navigate if they continued westward toward San Francisco, or the airport they could return to if they chose the safer option of landing immediately at Denver, where emergency services were already mobilized. Rebecca's mind worked through the decision tree with practiced efficiency. Captain Morrison needed immediate advanced medical care, which argued for returning to Denver, where ambulances and hospitals were readily available. But the aircraft was flying normally, all systems functioning properly, the only emergency being medical rather than mechanical. First Officer Park was perfectly qualified to complete the flight to San Francisco with Rebecca assisting from the left seat, and continuing westward would put them closer to their destination while Morrison received whatever medical attention the flight attendants could provide in the cabin. The key question was Morrison's condition, and whether 20 more minutes to Denver or 90 minutes to San Francisco made a meaningful difference in his prognosis. "Sarah, check with the flight attendants on the captain's status," Rebecca directed. "I need to know if they think he's stable enough for us to continue to San Francisco, or if he needs emergency medical services immediately." Sarah used the interphone to communicate with Jennifer, who reported that Morrison was breathing but unconscious, his pulse weak and irregular, possibly indicating a heart attack or stroke. The flight attendants had administered oxygen and were monitoring his vital signs, but they had no medical equipment beyond basic first aid supplies, no defibrillator or advanced medications that might make a difference in his survival. Jennifer's voice conveyed her concern that Morrison's condition could deteriorate rapidly, that every minute mattered if he was indeed having a cardiac event. Rebecca made her decision with the confidence born from years of command experience, weighing the competing priorities and choosing the option that best served everyone aboard. Denver departure, Flight 247 is requesting to return to Denver International for an immediate landing. We need the longest available runway and emergency medical services standing by to meet the aircraft. Captain requires immediate transport to a hospital for possible cardiac event. We have sufficient fuel and the aircraft is operating normally. Estimate 15 minutes to landing. The controller responded immediately with vectors back toward the airport, clearing them to descend to 7,000 feet and turn left heading 090 to intercept the localizer for runway 34L, the same runway they had departed from 15 minutes earlier. Rebecca flew the aircraft smoothly through the turn, her hands and feet working the controls with the unconscious precision that came from 15,000 hours of experience, while Sarah managed the radios, navigation systems, and checklists with growing confidence. They worked together as a practiced crew despite having never flown together before, their professionalism and training creating an immediate synchronization that allowed them to function effectively under pressure. As they descended back toward Denver, Rebecca allowed herself a moment to reflect on the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought her to this cockpit. An hour earlier, she had been denied access to this same flight deck by security protocols, marked as just another curious passenger who didn't understand modern aviation security. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same system that prevented her from a courtesy visit had been overridden instantly when her expertise became essential to survival. The security doors that remained impenetrable under normal circumstances suddenly opened wide when crisis demanded it. She wondered what Jennifer thought now about that earlier denial, whether the flight attendant recognized the woman in the cockpit as the same passenger who had politely requested a conversation with the pilots during boarding. "Cabin crew, this is the cockpit," Rebecca announced over the PA system, her calm voice designed to reassure the passengers who were certainly aware that something unusual was happening. "This is Captain Chen speaking. As you may have noticed, we're returning to Denver due to a medical emergency involving one of our crew members. The aircraft is operating normally and will be landing in approximately 12 minutes. Please follow all instructions from your flight attendants and remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Emergency services will meet the aircraft, but this is purely precautionary. Thank you for your cooperation and patience." Her announcement struck the right balance between honesty and reassurance, acknowledging the situation without causing unnecessary panic. The passengers absorbed this information with varying reactions. Some remained calm and trusting, others looked worried and began texting family members about the emergency. A few demanded more details from the flight attendants who moved through the cabin preparing for an early landing. Rebecca heard murmurs of conversation as passengers speculated about what was happening, why they were returning, whether the medical emergency involved someone in the cabin or one of the crew. The young woman across the aisle from Rebecca's empty seat asked her companion nervously if this meant something was wrong with the plane, not understanding that medical emergencies and mechanical emergencies were entirely separate categories, that perfectly functioning aircraft returned to airports regularly for non-mechanical reasons. In the cockpit, Rebecca and Sarah worked through the approach preparation with professional efficiency, programming the FMS for the ILS approach to runway 34L, briefing the approach parameters, and coordinating with air traffic control for priority handling. Denver approach vectored them smoothly onto the localizer, giving them a long final approach that would allow for a stable descent and landing without rushing. Flight 247, you're cleared for the ILS runway 34L approach. Contact tower on 124.35, the approach controller transmitted, his voice professional but conveying awareness of their emergency status. Sarah switched frequencies and checked in with the tower, who immediately confirmed that emergency services were positioned and ready, that the runway was clear, and that they were cleared to land with priority over all other traffic. Rebecca flew the approach with textbook precision, capturing the glideslope and localizer with smooth control inputs, maintaining the proper descent rate and airspeed. As the runway grew larger ahead, Sarah called out altitudes and airspeeds, monitoring systems and providing the backup that made two-pilot operations safer than single-pilot flight, her earlier panic completely replaced by professional competence. At 500 feet, Rebecca called for landing gear down, and Sarah moved the gear lever while monitoring the hydraulic pressure and 3 green lights that confirmed all 3 gear were down and locked. At 200 feet, the runway filled their windscreen, the threshold approaching rapidly as Rebecca adjusted power and pitch for the perfect touchdown point. The main gear kissed the runway with barely a squeak, Rebecca's years of experience translating into a landing so smooth that passengers barely felt the transition from flight to ground roll. She deployed the spoilers and applied reverse thrust, the deceleration pressing everyone forward in their seats as the aircraft slowed rapidly. "Nicely done, Captain," Sarah said with genuine admiration, recognizing the skill that had produced such a perfect landing under emergency conditions. Rebecca smiled slightly, acknowledging the compliment while maintaining focus on the rollout, guiding the aircraft off the runway at the first high-speed taxiway and following the ground controller's instructions to taxi to a designated parking area where emergency vehicles were already waiting. As they approached the parking spot, Rebecca could see the assembled emergency services, fire trucks with flashing lights, ambulances with paramedics standing ready, airport operations vehicles, and the usual circus that accompanied any aircraft emergency declaration. She brought the aircraft to a smooth stop and set the parking brake, then began the shutdown procedures while Sarah coordinated with the flight attendants to prepare for Captain Morrison's evacuation. The moment the engines spooled down, paramedics rushed up the jetway stairs that ground crew had positioned at the forward door, their equipment ready to stabilize Morrison and transport him to the hospital. Rebecca remained in the left seat monitoring systems while the medical team worked in the forward galley, ensuring that all aircraft safety protocols were properly executed even as the emergency continued to unfold. She completed the shutdown checklist methodically, noting maintenance items and ensuring the aircraft was properly configured for ground operations. Through the windscreen, she watched passengers deplaning through a rear door, some looking shaken and others simply annoyed at the delay, none of them aware of how close their routine flight had come to potential disaster during those critical seconds after rotation when First Officer Park had suddenly found herself alone in command during the most dangerous phase of flight. Finally, the paramedics loaded Captain Morrison onto a stretcher and rushed him down the jetway toward the waiting ambulance, their urgent movement suggesting his condition remained serious. Jennifer appeared in the cockpit doorway, her face showing emotional exhaustion mixed with profound relief. "Captain Chen," she said quietly, "I cannot thank you enough for what you did today. If you hadn't been on this flight," she trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought about what might have happened without Rebecca's intervention. Rebecca stood and faced the flight attendant, seeing her own reflection in Jennifer's eyes, a woman who had been just another passenger an hour earlier, denied cockpit access by proper security protocols, now being thanked for saving everyone aboard. "You did exactly the right thing following those security procedures during boarding," Rebecca said kindly. "Those rules exist for good reasons, and you couldn't have known who I was or that this emergency would happen. What matters is that when the crisis occurred, you remembered me and got me to the cockpit quickly. That kind of thinking under pressure is what saved this flight just as much as anything I did." Sarah emerged from the right seat and extended her hand to Rebecca with genuine warmth. "Captain Chen, I don't know how I can possibly thank you. When Captain Morrison collapsed, I thought, I couldn't stop composing myself. I've never been so scared in my entire life. But the moment you sat down in that left seat, I knew we were going to be okay. The way you took command, the way you flew that approach, the way you made me feel competent instead of panicked, that's what real captains do." Rebecca shook her hand firmly, recognizing in Sarah's eyes the same gratitude and respect that came from being pulled back from the edge of disaster by someone whose expertise and calm made the impossible seem routine. This time she would remain a passenger throughout the flight, anonymous in content, her services not needed, the pilots doing their jobs with the routine competence that characterized the vast majority of commercial flights. She would arrive in San Francisco, attend the graduation, hug her daughter, and tell the story of why she had been delayed, a story that would seem impossible except for being entirely true. And somewhere in Denver, Captain Morrison would hopefully recover, First Officer Park would process the trauma and emerge as a better pilot, and Flight 247 would become another aviation incident report, another near disaster averted, another reminder that the difference between tragedy and survival often comes down to seconds, skill, and the presence of someone who knows exactly what to do when everything goes wrong. The aircraft lifted off smoothly into the Colorado sky, climbing westward toward San Francisco and carrying Rebecca away from the morning's drama toward the celebration that had been her original destination. She closed her eyes and let herself relax, finally, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the emergency slowly fading as her body recognized that the crisis had passed, that she had done everything required of her, that she could finally return to being just another passenger on just another flight. But deep inside, she carried the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing her expertise had mattered when it counted most, that decades of training and experience had converged in 20 minutes of precision flying that saved over 100 lives, That she had been denied access to the cockpit right up until the moment when accessing that cockpit became the only thing standing between survival and potential catastrophe. And in that knowledge, she found validation for every hour spent training, every emergency procedure memorized, every simulation flown, every skill perfected, because when the moment came, she had been ready. And that readiness had made all the difference between the flight that returned safely and the tragedy that never happened, because someone who knew exactly what to do was sitting in seat 12A when expertise became survival and anonymity became irrelevant.